We will get going now. This is our first online program. We've had a great response. That's why we're going to do Facebook Live, but that doesn't look like it's working very well. But we will have it recorded and we'll share it to our Facebook later. We'll have it on YouTube. We hope you'll check out our website for more events. At the end, I will be sending out a survey. It's totally optional if you'd like to fill it out or not. And now I'll just turn it over to Greg.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the presentation. Oops, let me get the right one here. And all right, so everybody's seeing that?
Yes.
Good evening, and welcome to a Zoom presentation. And I want you to know that as I'm going to present a lot of material, and we are going to kind of go through it. I'm not sure that I won't be able to see the chat box, but if there's a strong question, one of the folks from the Bangor Public Library will ask that. And at the end, we're going to stop and kind of have a time for question and answer. I want to kind of give my thanks to both Jen, Candace, and Claire at the Bangor Public Library for hosting this. This is the third in a hopefully an ongoing series, as long as we are practicing social distancing, of some online wild mushroom presentations in Maine and northern New England mushrooms. And this one is hosted both by the Bangor Public Library and the Maine Mycological Association. And because of the topic, the Northern New England Poison Center. And we'll talk more about them, both of them in the resource area when we get to it. And I'm Greg Marley, and welcome to kind of foraging for mushrooms and learning your toxic mushrooms. And I made a decision to focus on toxic mushrooms because if you're going to be foraging for edible mushrooms, you really need to spend as much time as you're learning to learn the common poisonous mushrooms in your area. So what we're going to cover is kind of a general introduction around mushroom poisonings, some common scenarios, and then we're going to start to introduce the toxic mushrooms as we look at the range of toxins that are in the different mushrooms. And mushroom toxins are grouped together based on what part of your anatomy they are going to choose to do their damage to, and we'll get into that. And then we're going to spend a little bit more time about some of the toxic mushrooms and the edible lookalikes, which are really the decisions leading to toxic mistakes. So let's dive in. Oh, and why isn't this letting me dive in? There we go. So man has known about toxic mushrooms for as long as it's been around and writing. And he says, as near as I can tell, he was making some form of mushroom chart. And that's where we go from here, from the silly to the sublime. And I want to do a disclaimer. I always struggle with doing a disclaimer because I have no lawyers on my staff, because I have no staff. But I want to acknowledge that I have been collecting, using, eating mushrooms for more than 45 years, and I am still on a learning curve. So a talk like this is a recognition that mushrooming is a pastime that both is rewarding, deeply rewarding, and has some risk. This is a presentation that is absolutely not designed as any sole preparation for making choices around eating or not eating a wild mushroom. Your responsibility as a forager is to learn your mushrooms and to surround yourself with a good amount of learning support and a range of options. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So America, after years of avoiding mushrooms as food, is diving in. You know, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s with an Irish father, a French-German mother who were at war around food. But for my father, there was no such thing as an edible mushroom because there were no such things as mushrooms allowed in our cuisine. So, you know, America's diving in. So wild forage mushrooms are really popular and enthused, and they are the thing. And everybody, you know, below the age of 40 is thinking about, you know, what is the sustainability? How can I locally source food? That interest in foraging is really, really growing. And the fact that it's an excuse to get you out into nature, into the woods, is deeply a value added. As an excuse to get into nature, mushrooming has been part of my life since my teens, because nature has been a part of how I kind of reconnect with my center and my soul. And now we're in this time of COVID. COVID crisis and the isolation has really been pushing people to get back into nature, because so far, other than with some exceptions, the forests have not been cut off. So people are getting out to nature, and it's driving that sense of self-sufficiency. I want to acknowledge the photograph in here. This is a beautiful, beautiful king bolete, the porcini, that I collected. And even as I was picking it, I recognized that growing right butt up against that stem was an Amanita, most likely Amanita crenulata, which is quite toxic. And so you've got to have the enthusiasm, and you have to have it kind of balanced with some caution. So in our restaurants, I've seen restaurants in this state, they're almost there and around the country, vying with each other on what kind of mushrooms they can bring in, what are the kinds of wild foods they have. And that competitive edge has made people push the envelope a couple of times. Over the years, over the past 10 years, we've had several Maine chefs who've been sickened after eating mushrooms that they got from foragers. So, and the caption is, "You really must try our mushroom soup, sir. It's to die for." And that's what we want to avoid. So far in the state of Maine, we haven't had any diners in restaurants who've eaten toxic mushrooms, to my knowledge, and I hope that's still the case. But what we've certainly seen is more
Hello.
mushrooms.
It just says, it gives Jen a message that it's
Oh, they haven't muted me, have they? So there are more people who are collecting mushrooms, and we're seeing a kind of lockstep increase in the people that are getting sick. So this interest is sometimes getting ahead of people's learning, and the resources they turn to. The internet has some really wonderful, wonderful mushroom identification resources, and there are some that are somewhat questionable. And a new forager especially, they only know what they know. And sometimes the learning is slow. And though there is a law on the books in the state of Maine that requires that mushrooms that are sold commercially as food pass through the hands of a certified person in identification. But there's no way of bringing that certification program into being, because it got stopped by the last governor. So people are pushing the limits, and people are making assumptions and therefore getting sick. And on the right-hand side there, it says, it's an old from 1500s. It says, fungi are mushrooms, and there be two manner of them. One manner is deadly and slayeth them that eat them. And we call those toadstools. And the other, they don't. And the reality is somewhere in between deadly mushrooms and those that just sicken us. And that's what we're diving into today. So in terms of 2019, the mushroom poisoning that I'm aware of, and I'm a active member of the the North American Mycological Association and their toxicology group. And so they gather the information they can from around the country if the people are sickened, and any sickenings that I am working with, I de-identify and send them the information on. And so we've had a couple of known deaths pretty much every year in recent years, and quite a few serious poisonings, even some serious poisonings in the northern New England area. Most of those are related to Amanitas and Amatoxins, which we'll talk about in a minute. And beyond that, we've had a lot of people who get sickened. You know, and the symptoms range from potentially life-threatening to mostly that kind of mild and moderate 4 to 8 to 12 hours of real distress. So let's dive in. So in terms of the Northern New England Poison Center, in the cases that I have dealt with over the past years, the range of mushrooms we've been seeing, we have seen some destroying angel, death cap sickenings, as well as some Amanita muscaria and volatipes, and the toxins will make more sense in a minute. We've had a number of people who've been sickened after eating boletes, and boletes that they thought were edible. So we're going to dive into those. Every year I deal with one or a few people who are sickened by eating the jack-o'-lantern mushroom. And almost always they eat them thinking that they were eating chanterelles. Poor mistake. We have some pigskin puffballs, a scleroderma, and almost every year somebody eats honey mushrooms undercooked or raw and gets sick, and occasionally the bluets. And once every few years, somebody who gets sick after eating false morels. And in Maine, right now, this week, early May, particularly this year since spring is late, false morels are in their glory. And we'll take look at some pictures of those in a minute. So of the scenarios that we deal with, both here in the Northern New England, as well as across the country, you know, roughly 8 out of 10 of them involve someone who's young, you know, under the age of 5, toddlers especially, and most of those kids, the calls come in asking for mushroom identification, asking for consultation, and most of those kids are asymptomatic. And overwhelmingly, they never develop symptoms. But if you're a parent or a caregiver, and you see a child with a mushroom, or worse yet, a part of a mushroom in their mouth, you want identification skills. The second most common situation involving people who have symptoms are what I call strangers in a strange land. And these are people from away, often from another country, who are in this region, and they're collecting mushrooms that they used to collect at home and used to eat at home, and they make mistakes based on regional knowledge. And increasingly, we have relatively new or novice foragers who don't know how much they don't know, and they make mistakes based on inadequate information and recklessness. That's called that misapplied generalities. Like all boletes are edible unless they have a red pore and stain blue. And in this part of the world, that's not true. And we'll learn more about that in a minute. And then I'm going to last two, I call one magic seeking, and the other magic thinking. And the magic seekers are those who are looking for psychoactive mushrooms, but don't do their homework in terms of what to collect and how to treat them. And so we get people either scared and feeling ill or actually sick. And the last one, I don't know how to treat. And that's I call it magical thinking. It's someone who says, oh, I found these mushrooms and they were beside my compost and they were pure, beautiful, white, gorgeous mushrooms. I just knew they had to be edible. And that's magical thinking. And we've had some mistakes made based on that kind of mistake of illogical thinking. So I'm going to talk with some mushroom myths, some that are untrue and some that are true. And these are some that I've run into. If a mushroom is fruiting on wood, it's not poisonous. Overwhelmingly, particularly with polypores, that's kind of mostly true. But there are some very, very toxic mushrooms, like the potentially deadly galerina, that fruits only on wood. So not quite true, and certainly not a safe guide. You know, if somebody else eats the mushroom, a snail, a slug, an insect, an animal, a deer, a squirrel, a vole, well, it must be edible, so because they wouldn't eat a toxic mushroom. And certainly in the insect world, they have very complex stomachs that can deal with some toxics we can't. And we don't know if those animals got sick after they ate the mushroom. So not a good thing to go on in terms of choosing your mushrooms. And from Europe, there's this age-old belief that if you cook a mushroom with a silver coin or a spoon, if it's toxic, it will turn the silver black. I have yet, in all the years I've been chasing toxic mushrooms, understood where that comes from and if it's ever true, but it's not a test for a poison mushroom. And some people believe that cooking mushrooms will destroy a toxin and make them okay. And in some toxic groups, that's very true, but it's not universal. So what about myths that are kind of truths? One, I need to tell you that picking a poisonous mushroom and handling it with your bare hands will not sicken you, other than a few of them which will cause a rash in very rarely in sensitive people. And breathing spores will not sicken you, it will not trigger the toxin, but there are some exceptions with that. People develop allergies to spores, especially those people who are harvesting mushrooms commercially in mushroom growing rooms. And if someone pops a puffball into your face and you get a big whiff of those spores, they can irritate your lungs. So those are the exceptions in there. And what I've learned is that sometimes the first story I hear about a mushroom sickening is not the whole story, because we get embarrassed. If I eat a mushroom and I get sick and I later learn, well, I probably should have cooked it, and someone asked me, so was that mushroom raw or not? I said, well, no, of course I cooked it. I've dealt with a case of that a few years ago, and it's only like I was following up with the person like the third or fourth day, they acknowledged, well, they hadn't actually cooked it. So we have to take our information a little bit carefully and with a grain of salt. And the last truisms, this one I'll go with. All mushrooms are edible, but as they say, some of them only once. And this beautiful, beautiful illustration from Kristen Hutley is of a series of death caps, likely the most toxic mushroom in the world and certainly responsible for most of the poisonings in the world. And fortunately, not maybe yet in Maine. There's one questionable collection of it. But let's dive in. Let's talk about the range of toxins, what we're facing. And the toxicology community classifies them in groups based on, as I told you, what they do to your body. And we're going to talk about 7 groups of toxins and then a couple that are our edge of learning. So we're going to talk about, first off, the worst ones, the cyclopeptides, the amatoxins, phallotoxins, and then the gyromitrins, the monomethylhydrazine, and then we'll go into some of the rest of them. So we'll skip this and we'll move on. So the cyclopeptides, the amatoxins, these are the worst of the worst. And this Amanita phalloides, this is the one photograph I did not take. I took this off of Wikipedia. But they are responsible for the majority of mushroom serious poisonings and deaths worldwide. And this is a toxin, no matter how much you cook it, is not broken down by cooking. But it has to be eaten to cause problems. So with all of the severe toxins, one of the truisms is there is a delayed onset of symptoms. So with the amatoxins and phallotoxins, on average, 6 to 10 hours, occasionally longer. And sometimes if someone eats a whole lot, it might be less. There was a woman who ate, by her description, 16 or 18 whole mushrooms of this beautiful white destroying angel. And her symptoms started in about 4 hours. And she had a very severe course of sickness and lost her life. That was not in Maine. So that initial phase is very severe GI symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and that generally lasts for just about a day. And then you clear up. You have this latency phase of no symptoms that might last for another 24 up to 36 hours. And if you haven't been seen by a medical provider and that medical provider has not tested your liver toxins, they might think that you're fine and send you home. And then the next range of symptoms is the breakdown of the liver functioning and secondarily kidney functioning. And without treatment or without good care, if you have enough of that toxin on board, death within 4 to 6 days. So it's got about a 50% mortality if you live in an area without good medical care, and about 10% mortality even with good care, in the absence of a liver transplant. So very, very severe. So let's talk about the mushrooms that cause this. We've got some amanitas, which we'll deal with, and then a few other really tiny ones, like the deadly galerina, which is in this photograph. And this is a galerina grows on wood. It's a small little brown mushroom. Most of the time, people would not be interested in it. And those that are the people that are seeking little brown mushrooms that they hope are psychoactive. And there's a couple others we'll talk about as we go. The big dangerous ones that is very, very common in northern New England is this destroying angel. Amanita virosa is its old name. Amanita bisporigera is its more formal current name. And I find them in mycorrhizal associations with trees in woodlands across the state of Maine. And I generally start to see them by the second or so week of August, and they're around through most of September, occasionally into October. And they are pure virginal white. I was walking with my son in the woods when he was about 5, and I said, "Look, Dash, a destroying angel." And he was looking in the trees for this hideous angel that was up there, and I was pointing out this gorgeous little white mushroom. So this is our most common large deadly species. And if you walk in the woods in the mid to late summer, you will have seen this mushroom. And you'll see this beautiful little skirted veil, the pure white spores, and this fat bulbous base that has a little bit of a sac that we call a vulva around it. Those are the pieces you'd see. Don't eat it, because those who I've talked to who have cooked it and eat it say it tastes good, but then it comes back really bad. So related to that, and I have found in several places in Maine, both just outside of Augusta, growing with oaks, and right in front of the Booth Bay High School, often every year with oaks, and several places down in the southern part of the state. And this is Amanita magnivalaris. It is another destroying angel with the same serious toxins, and they grow in bunches, so there's often a lot of them. It's a big, beautiful, robust mushroom, and the partial veil, the ring on this is quite membranous and skirted. It's quite large, very dangerous. And finally, this other one is in the same group, Amanita decipiens. It would be another destroying angel. I have found it a couple places in sandy soil. I'm thinking, down in the southwestern part of the state, around Massabesic Forest and all those really sandy woodlands. I'll bet there's more of it. I just don't tromp in those woods often enough. And then beyond that, we have some small mushrooms, like this one. The traditional name is Canosabe phalaris, or the deadly Canosabe. It's also called Foliatina. That's its more recent name, because taxonomists are always bouncing these things around. And this is a little LBM, the size of the cap is maybe 1.5 inches at most. And it has this very obvious kind of collar-like ring on the stalk. It just shines. And this is much more common than people give it credit for. And again, it's a little brown mushroom that's a risk to little grazer ages, the kids that are crawling, or people who are looking for hallucinogens and mistake it for a psilocybin. So I'm finding it more and more common on paths through the forest where they use wood chips as a bedding for the path, because that's the kind of soil that it really loves. I found hundreds of them fruiting on the grounds of the Maine Botanic Garden down in Booth Bay a couple of years. So keep your eyes open for them. And if you use wood chips in your garden or around your property, that would be where it very likely would grow. So I'm going to skip. I want to acknowledge that within this group there are some little lepiotas that have been causing problems, not very commonly, but at least one in northern New England that caused a death, not in northern New England, down in northern New York a few years ago. And for the second class, this is the gyromitrin. That's the name of the toxin found in the mushroom. And in our bodies, it gets broken down to a couple different compounds that are hydrazines. And the most famous one is monomethylhydrazine. And for those of you in the room who are rocket scientists, you'll know this as something that is well known as a rocket fuel and very well studied in that field. It's very toxic, it's very volatile, and has caused a number of numerous sickenings and, at least across the world, some deaths. With this one as well, there's a delayed onset up to about 24 hours, and the initial is that vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. But it's followed up by headaches and dizziness, muscle cramps, and then it gets into your nervous system, causing seizures, coma, and can be some kidney and liver failure. Here is the interesting thing about this mushroom. In some parts of Maine, the traditional people have called this Morels, and they eat them. And people can eat these and do so without harm if they're well cooked until they reach a certain threshold limit. And when they pass that threshold, they get sick, and they get severely sick. So there's not just, I'm going to throw up a little bit, it really overwhelms you. So these are called false morels, and this is the most common one. Far more common in Maine and northern New England than the true morel. It's a beautiful mushroom, and the gyromitrin is pretty high in some of these. It's also in some other false morels, as well as some other ascomycete seed mushrooms in the helvellas and verpas. I got to tell you, I just got my fungi magazine the other day, and there was an article on this group of toxins and this group of mushrooms. They have not been well studied, so people are cautious and need to be cautious. So this is the classic one. Generally associated with pine. I'm finding it right now in full fruiting, and it should be kind of going over the top and edging out, except we've had a cool spring. We've had some poisonings in Maine with people, particularly if it's undercooked, and we've had some severe poisonings across the United States. This is one you'll find fruiting about the same time as the violets. Quite beautiful. This is a different one. This is Gyromitra gigas. It's a different false morel. I don't find it often. This is a photograph I took about a week ago. It's more pale, kind of yellowish tan, more rounded. And it's also, I found it with conifers, pine and hemlock, but only a few times. A friend of mine has found it repeatedly with red pine in more western Maine. And again, in southern parts around the mid-Atlantic, where it's more common, people eat these, but it's also been found to contain some gyromitrin. So, you know, I would be really cautious about it. So here's both. The top right and the left hand are the Gyromitra esculenta, and the bottom one is the Gyromitra gigas. Very distinct from each other. And here's the two together. You'll notice the esculenta, the false morel, is in this picture, it's almost brown. And this was growing in the open. We've had a lot of cool weather. They're darker where I've been finding them this year. And here's false morels and the couple of true morels in the center. So you can really see significant difference in their shape. And if you cut them open, the true morel is on the right-hand side, it's completely hollow from the top to the bottom. Whereas the false morel, the stem is kind of got little hollows and stuffed patches. It's very different. So eat your true morels if you're lucky enough to find them in Maine, but avoid the false morels. So let's move on to the next common toxin. It's called muscarine. And this is one that's found in a lot of little brown mushrooms and a few others I'll tell you about. And this is one where the onset of symptoms is quite rapid, can be starting as quickly as 20 minutes, typically all this within an hour, and you develop what's known in the healthcare field as sludge, salivation, lacrimation, so you're producing a lot of saliva, this urgent urination and defecation. So hypermotility is that diarrhea and vomiting. And in a high dose, this have caused some deaths. But there is one thing, this is the only mushroom toxin where we have an antidote. If you show up at an emergency department and they suspect by the symptoms and what you've eaten that there might be this, if they give you an injection of atropine, it acts as an antidote. And this is found in some small mushrooms and a couple large ones. I'm going to deal with a couple of the groups. One of these is this really large group of tiny mushrooms called anosabes. They're called fiber caps, and you can see the fibrous cap on some of them. Not all of them do. And they're little brown mushrooms about the same size as some of the psilocybins. And in fact, this one, Inosabe calamistrata, actually has the base of the stem, when handled, turns blue, which is even more going to confuse the people that are looking for psilocybin. It's never been found to have psilocybin that they know of, but it does contain muscarine, so people get sick. Here's a couple of others. This beautiful one, this little Inosabe geophylla. It's kind of a lilac purple color, particularly when it's young. And I have found this a number of times fruiting in wood mulch at the base of trees in parks. It's gorgeous, so it'd be easy one for a kid to pick up. Many of the fiber caps have these fibrous streaks along the top of the cap. Another group that has it in some of the species, the entelomas. Some of them contain muscarine, some of them contain gastrointestinal irritants. And they are little mushrooms, most of them, some of them larger. This one is maybe up to 3 inches across, with attached whitish to tannish gills that have a pinkish buff spore print. A large genus, hard to identify. And then moving on from muscarine, this is an odd little toxin. They call it the Coprine, and it has an anabuse reaction. It occurs in some edible mushrooms that are edible so long as you don't drink alcohol with them, or within a day or two after them. Because if you do, the alcohol will trigger nausea, vomiting, rapid heartbeat. It's like an anabuse reaction. Anabuse is something that's used to treat chronic alcohol use disorders. And we find it in a couple of species. One of them is this clubfoot clatosape, which is now Ampuloclatosape clavipiece. And this is a mushroom that's really common in the late fall in our pine forests, and is edible if you cook it and eat it without alcohol. And the other one that's really common is the alcohol inky. And we find it in every community. Mostly I see it where someone has knocked down trees or cut trees and is growing from the stump or the buried roots. And it's part of the inky caps because as it matures, the cap dissolves into an inky mess. And people really enjoy it as an edible, and just don't mix it with alcohol. So in this case, is the mushroom poisonous or is the alcohol the poison? That's kind of the question. It's certainly working together. I'm going to deal with the psychoactives together, and this is they classify them two different groups. One is the ibotenic acid muscimol that's found in the Amanita muscaria and a few, and the other is the indoles, psilocybin and psilocin, baeocystin, that group. And these are compounds that have a mood-altering and mind-altering properties, both of them onset generally within 60 minutes. They're known for this sense of euphoria, expansiveness, particularly the psilocybin, heightened perception, some hallucinations and delusions. Both of them historically have a long history of ritual use around the world. And certainly since the late 1950s and 60s, a significant history of recreational use. The psilocybin group were made illegal in this country in the late 1960s and remain illegal. The ibotenic acid group has not been. But, you know, particularly with the movie, the Fantastic Fungi, it has broadened out the interest in the psilocybin group especially, and there's been a lot of active research over the past decade and a half into some medicinal applications that is quite interesting and exciting, and I'm looking forward to see what happens there. But particularly, the psilocybin toxins can be very dangerous for infants or toddlers because they can spark a very high fever and even convulsions. So really, some caution in that area is needed. So let's talk about some of the mushrooms. We'll talk about firstly the psilocybin containing ones, and then we'll deal with the muscimol ibotenic acid. So this mushroom here, if you live in Maine and you have a lawn, I can almost assure you, you have the lawnmower or haymaker's mushroom, Paniolus phoenicia. It is very, very common after a couple of rains from early summer through the summer months. I get calls, the Poison Center reaches out to me numerous times a year because little kids have collected these mushrooms and eaten them or have been playing with them. And most of the populations don't have a significant amount of the psilocybin in it, but occasionally they do. And there have been a couple of cases of toddlers who have gotten intoxicated. You will find these in your lawn in the early morning after a rain the day before. And probably almost as common is this Gymnopolis luteus. It's called the laughing mushroom because of the effect it has on some people. And this is a saprobe on dead wood. Usually I find it most commonly on birch and maple, sometimes on beech. And it has this distinctive ring around the stalk that as it matures, you see the orangish red deposit of spores because it has an orangish brown spore print. And, you know, it's sometimes grows in clusters, sometimes individually from wood specifically. And it can be quite common. It also resembles some species of Pholiota. And it has been shown to contain some of the same indoles and has been used recreationally. Some people are actually growing the mushroom for that effect, though it remains illegal to use. We have had some species of psilocybin in Maine. This is one that I have found. I'm not sure how often it has been found in general. And they're little brown mushrooms. These were growing on chipped wood in an area that had been cleared. And here, you can't see it in this photograph. It's a blue staining on the stem. It's not at all an easy identification. There's a couple other species that have been reported from Maine. These are not mushrooms you want to mess with unless you really know what you're doing. Be cautious. So if we move on to the Amanita muscaria, the toxin, they call it the pantherine syndrome because Amanita pantherina is a group of really potent in this area. For this, again, onset usually within an hour, sometimes up to 3 hours. Often starts out with nausea, vomiting, but then it can go on to agitation, incoordination, and the agitation can be flipped back and forth with deep sleep. I mean, deep, almost coma-like, that can scare family or medical providers because you can't wake the person up. It also, there's often confusion and sometimes hallucinations and visual distortion. That feeling of great strength, because sometimes seen, there's a question whether this group of mushrooms were used by the berserkers in Northern Europe to kind of get into that frenzy that they had. So these are found in several species of Amanita, and it can really sicken people. It's rarely fatal but it can be problematic. And I'll talk to you about some of the mushrooms where it has caused some fatalities. So this is Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, because it attracts flies and it has been used to attract and kill flies historically. Really common from midsummer and into the late fall, most frequent in the late fall, growing with trees. Hard to miss this bright yellow-orange color. There's some other varieties of this in the western part of the country and in Europe and Eurasia that are bright, almost cherry red. So this causes problems for humans, and we've had some pretty significant issues with it in this region. It's also something that dogs and even cats are attracted to and eat, and sometimes very significantly it has caused fatalities. Usually they can ride their way through it. So here's a range from the really tiny ones, and sometimes there have been reports of these being mistaken for puffballs and sickening people. And here, this is the most reddish one I've ever seen. It's usually this paler color. And these flecks of the universal veil that get left on the cap, in a heavy rain, they'll get washed off. And related to that, this is called Amanita volatipes. It's one of the panther groups. And there's a couple of others that in this group that contain more intense doses of the toxins and can be very severe in the symptoms they cause. And this is one where there has been a death attributed to it up in Quebec some years ago. It looks like a tan Amanita muscaria. And you often see on these this kind of rolled rim at the top of the swollen bulb. Can be very common. I find it sometimes in parks or in lawns growing under trees. So it's not necessarily deep in the woods. And finally, little Amanita crenulata in the woods pretty commonly. Again, very significant concentrations of ibotenic acid. There are people who use these recreationally. I would never suggest it. It's just a dangerous ride. Causes problems. But, you know, in terms of being illustrated and photographed and some of the myths and stories we have related to Amanita muscaria, particularly coming out of Europe and Eurasia, are huge. There's a reason we believe that reindeer can fly. This is a mushroom that reindeer love. They love mushrooms in general, but this one they will chase after and eat, and they get high and agitated. So maybe they are flying. That's why we believe that Santa, who wears a red suit, can fly through the sky. And this is the mushroom that was illustrated and talked about in Alice in Wonderland. So I'm going to get into now the gastrointestinal irritants. And these are the most common, by far, form of mushroom poisoning that we run into. And some of the mistakes made in Maine and northern New England are directly related to these. Usually it's a pretty rapid onset. Usually 1 to 2 hours, sometimes up to 4. Usually resolve that throwing up and nausea and diarrhea within about 8 hours, sometimes longer with some of these. Really uncomfortable. So let's talk about them. There's a large number of genera that contain irritants, and there's a number of different toxins, different groups that trigger them, and some of them are not well understood. So I'm going to talk about the more common ones. This one, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, an incredible, bright, beautiful mushroom, bright orange, and glows, literally glows in the dark. And sometimes people mistake these for chanterelles. They grow in these dense clusters, maybe up to 2 feet wide, some of them, the clusters. Amanita, or the chanterelles never grow in clusters. And these young gills is where you would see them glowing in the dark in a very, very dark room, quite magical. But if you eat them, usually it's up to at least 7 hours of nasty vomiting, diarrhea, in distress. So avoid them. Here them growing on the base of an oak tree, right at the base, which is a really typical place. And here we have 4 beautiful chanterelles, a golden chanterelle, and a cluster of the more orange jack-o'-lantern mushroom. Learn to distinguish both of them. I told you about the entelomas with muscarine. Some of them also contain gastrointestinal irritants, so be aware of that group. And in the boletes, boy, increasingly, I'm seeing a number of sickenings each year from members of this group of mushrooms. And the boletes are fleshy mushrooms that have pores instead of gills, a range of different colors. It's always been known that those that have red pores that stain blue are problematic, but there's a number of the ones that have yellow pores like this that stain blue that are a problem. And that bluing, I used the tip of my knife to spell bolete, and as fast as I could write it, the blue staining appeared. So let's talk about the common ones. This one here is called the lilac brown bolete, and it's common from midsummer through into mid-fall in a number of different forests. It's got this unmistakable, when it's young, lilac color, and then goes to this brown, hence the name lilac brown bolete. It's quite firm and meaty, and you almost never find that these have been eaten by any bugs. And that right there should tell you something's wrong. So if you cook them up, they taste good, and you have a horrible ride. This is the only mushroom that I have ever been sickened by. Happened in 1986. And we've had 30 or 40 different cases that I'm aware of in northern New England from these mushrooms. Don't eat them. And Boletus sensibilis is a bolete that has those yellow pores and it quickly stains red. This mushroom also, if you smell it, it's very distinct. Some people call it curry or fenugreek. I think it smells like chicken bouillon, those old chicken bouillon cubes we had as a kid. It's pretty widespread, pretty common, and people mistake it for two very edible lookalikes. Be really cautious in these reddish colored, yellow pored, blue staining boletes. Unless you really know what you're doing and are somewhat of an expert, be cautious and avoid them. And any of the ones that have red pores and stained blue, like this Boletus subvolutipes, there are a few people who claim that they eat these. I think it's mushroom roulette, but most people get sick. And they instantly, as soon as you cut them, all parts of them or bruise them will stain distinctly blue. And the final group, I want to talk about two others. This is another beautiful pale brown, slightly yellow flesh mushroom that can grow, I've seen them 10, 12 inches in diameter and buttons the size of my fist. So they're a beautiful mushroom, and yet I'm increasingly seeing people sickened by them. They typically grow, I find them most often with hemlock, and those people who eat these and get sick, 12 hours and sometimes more of pretty serious GI problems, and sometimes even some platelet problems. Nasty group of mushrooms. So here's one that someone I know sliced to cook and took photographs. You can see that yellow flesh and the slight blue staining. And here's one, I scratched it and it pretty quickly stained, not an edulus. So it's not a porcini, which is sometimes it gets mistaken for. Know your mushrooms. And people on this who are viewing this, who eat the lexinums, particularly the red-topped ones, are going to get after me, because often this is viewed as a safe edible group. But over 30 years of reports about mushroom poisonings in the country, about 3% of them were from this genus of mushrooms. And there's a ton of different species, and most field guides at best will treat 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 species. So identifying them to species is a challenge, and we've been seeing more significant gastrointestinal cases with these mushrooms almost every year. So be cautious about them. They're not a safe group. And I'm just going to quickly go through the puffballs. These pigskin puffballs, thick. They're very distinctive with a thick rim around it, and they quickly, the center turns a dark black or purple black. Several different species we have in the state. Sometimes when they're really young, you still see that thick outer ring, but they can be white before they turn that dark color. This is a problematic mushrooms because some people eat them, and they eat them successfully. And I talked with a woman whose neighbor up at camp generously gave some of these to her and her husband because he loved them and he had more than he could use. And she sliced them up and cooked them and ate them. And she said both she and her husband were sick as dogs within about 25 minutes. Be cautious. And just want to acknowledge the coral mushrooms. They're a difficult, particularly this Ramaria group, a difficult group to distinguish, and some really significant sickenings we've had over the years. So those are the kind of active ones, but I want to mention there are some other causes of mushroom-related sickness, and some of it is caused by mushrooms that are undercooked, like this gorgeous sulfur shell chicken of the woods, which is a great edible mushroom. If you undercook it or ever eat it raw, it will make you sick. The other thing is we have people who overindulge in mushrooms and overwhelm their system, or they eat mushrooms that are too old and have started to go bad, and they get sickened by bacterial contamination. And sometimes, you know, mushrooms are hard for us to digest. And so we get this, sometimes people react to them. And this quote I took from a woman from Ontario, Canada, just summed it up. And she says, you know, I can eat anything, I mean anything, but 1 teaspoon of a cooked puffball, just the most benign, recognizable edible you will find, will cause me the kind of grief I'd really rather not describe here. My husband can eat them until the cows come home. But where I can happily eat a plate full of pine mushrooms, which is a gorgeous bolete, the same mushroom will cause my husband the same kind of reaction that I'd prefer not to describe. You know, it's very, very individual. I don't know why, it just is. That is what I mean by idiosyncratic. We're all built differently. So when you start eating wild mushrooms, start slow, eat small amounts, and be cautious when you share them with other people. So the ones that sometimes sicken because of undercooking include the yellow morel. All morels are toxic raw, and the chicken of the woods, as well as this mushroom, which not many people eat. This is called the platterful mushroom. Though those who eat it usually do because they find it's the first large gilled mushroom to fruit in the late spring. And so it's tempting. It's not very good. And if you undercook it, you'll get sick. But the other ones that will make you sick undercooked include the honey mushrooms and the bluets. So the honey mushroom, which is a great edible, and often you can collect them by the basketful. There are some people that don't tolerate it well, and if you eat it undercooked, it will definitely make you sick. As well, any of the chicken mushrooms. These are ones some people don't tolerate well, and I wonder if they've been undercooked or they eat too much of it, or they eat it when it's too old. So be cautious. This group includes at least 3 species up here. The classic chicken of the woods or sulfur shelf, the Ladioporus cincinnatus that grows on the ground at the base of trees, and this one which grows on conifer. And if you ever feel like it's fruiting on conifer, do not eat it, because it's one that'll make you sick. Have I scared you yet? Are you worried? And the bluet, another wonderful edible that's sometimes cultivated, is toxic if raw or undercooked. And this is one where someone first told me that he had cooked it, and later told me that he'd actually eaten 1 mushroom raw and had a very unpleasant several days of intermittent gastrointestinal distress. I was really worried about it. So before we get to the final piece, I want to just kind of talk really quickly about a couple of mushrooms. We never learned this mushroom was deadly or understand why until about 30 or 40 years ago. And people who may eat this over time can develop an allergic reaction. You develop antigens, and if you eat it one more time, it triggers an immense breakdown of red blood cells, which can lead to kidney failure and sometimes death. So the poison packs can be really common in certain areas of the state, particularly in landscaped areas, is where I find it abundantly. And aurellanine, this belongs to a group of mushrooms, the Cortinarius, that very few people eat. And this is one where we just began to understand because it's a very delayed onset. So if I get sick 10 days after I eat a mushroom, most of the time people are not going to say, oh, it's that mushroom I ate 10 days ago. But has caused some significant problems, including kidney failure and death, at least in Europe. No significant poisonings in this region, at least one up in Michigan. And this is a type of oyster mushroom. It's called angel wings. It's in a different genus. Grows on conifer wood, very well-rotted wood. It's a beautiful little mushroom. It's long been considered a great edible. But we had a situation in Japan. Back in 2004, they had a lot of typhoons, a lot of rain. And so these mushrooms fruited heavily. And they love them. They make tempura with them. And there were a number of older Japanese adults, average age 69, who became quite ill, and 14 of them died after eating these mushrooms. That's the only thing they had in common. And all of them had significant history of kidney dysfunction. So if you have kidney problems, don't touch these mushrooms. And quite honestly, they're off my edible list because of that question about what's the causing it. So the long and short of it is be cautious. Be cautious about eating mushrooms and think about their resources. If you're ever sickened or you're concerned you might sick, reach out to the Northern New England Poison Center, who have kind of co-hosting this. I have nothing but respect for their staff, and I've dealt with some poison centers in other areas, but they're nice, they're organized, they're smart, they do good service. Consider if you want to learn mushroomings, join the Maine Mycological Association. It's a 12-year annual membership or $12 annual membership. We host forays across the state, which is a great way to learn mushrooms. And absolutely, find good resources to learn your mushroom, both edible and toxic. So go slowly, with patience, before you ever eat new mushrooms. That's my last word. There is this, I did a booklet covering the most common toxic mushrooms in this region and their edible lookalikes, where there are some, and it's available on the Maine Mushrooms website as a download. If you take a picture of this, you'll get the link, but if you just go to mainlymushrooms.org, it's posted on the kind of open blog, and it'd be handy. You could download it and print it if you want to. All color photographs. And finally, my book Chanterelle Dreams, I've got several chapters that deal with toxic mushrooms as well as the favorite edibles. It is still in print and available through your local booksellers and online. And the medicinal mushroom book that I wrote is only available through Kindle at this point. It's out of print. But I will be doing the next one of these talks on health promoting mushrooms and the use of them in New England. So with that said, just be aware that we've got a number of classes coming up, if we are able to do classes face-to-face in the late summer and fall, as well as the forays through the Maine Mycological. Every year, my best friend and I do a 5-day mushroom, we call it mushroom camp, up at Eagle Hill in Washington County to really deal into mushroom identification for novices. But absolutely, if you email me with your email, I'll add you to a list and send out a schedule in the next few weeks about the classes I'm intending to do this late summer and fall. And with that, why don't we go ahead and open up, and we can, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I can see the chat questions, and we can deal with questions. But we'll leave with Rumi and an old quote from him, who said, "Let the beauty you love be what you do. There are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth." And for me, mushroom is first and foremost one of those ways.
Thank you, Greg. This has been awesome. I'm working on, okay, I did unmute successfully on Jennifer, and we do have some questions coming up in the Facebook Live chat, which we made work a little while ago, so that's exciting. And then I think there's one in the Zoom chat, so.
Great.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that information that you just gave about the PDF, We do have a page on our website at the Bangor Public Library. It's for the seed swap programming and events. And we have resources where we've added mushroom foraging that I'll add that to. And
Great.
if you want to give me your email, I can put that there too in case people want to email and be added to your.
You got my email. Yeah.
Yes, I do have your email.
So that's the numbers of poisonings. How recent are they? Most of what I gave you was for the past several years. I keep up with that as much as I can.
Thank you. And then, let's see, on Facebook, where did we go? Someone wanted to know what causes the problem with chicken of the wood growing on conifers?
Well, it's a different species. So if it's, the Ladeoporus sulphureus grows on hardwoods. If it's a chicken lookalike that grows on conifers, it's likely Ladeoporus heronensis. And it's just got some toxins in it that are problematic. So it's a species issue. It's a mushroom. It's not the same thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone's wondering if you'll include chaga info in another information session.
When I do the talk on medicinal mushrooms on June 4th through the Belfast Library, I'll talk a lot about chaga. And Rod asks, hi Rod, if there's a look-alike to chaga. And there are some black woody mushrooms. There's one that grows on cherry. It's not poisonous, but nor would it give you anything. It's just problematic. Yeah.
Let's see. I don't know if I missed you answering the question about the chemical causes bullets to turn blue.
There's been some studies on that. It's an air reaction. So when the cell gets broken, cell wall with handling, it's an interaction between something in the cell and air. And I don't know the exact nature of the compound. I think there's been some work done on that.
Thank you. On Facebook, Beth would like to know if there's an increase in people harvesting wild mushrooms over the last 5 to 10 years.
Oh, an immense increase. I started doing mushroom identification workshops and there was an interest, but the interest over the past 4, 5, 10 years has just been immense as people start to recognize the value and overcome their fears of mushrooms and want to learn about it. And the most common people I find diving into it are people around the age of retirement who suddenly find themselves have time and can do this, or people in their 20s and 30s who are kind of reconnecting with the land in really healthy ways.
Thank you. So I'm going to unmute. I see Cynthia, you had your hand raised. You were unmuted. You want to ask your question?
Oh, hi. Yeah, we're wondering about older, like reishi and turkey tail. If we find some nowadays, is it okay to use them?
No, it's just like in the same way that if you go out in your garden at the beginning of the year, you're going to find some desiccated winter squash that you did not harvest. And you can say, yeah, it's still a winter squash, but all that vitality of the food is gone. Just like the turkey tail, which is an annual growth, it died last October with the first hard frost, and it's leathery and hard now, but it's not going to give you anything beneficial. You want them fresh and active and vital. Chaga is the one thing that can be collected and used year-round medicinally.
So not until the fall then? Is that when they first become available?
Turkey tails generally from about mid-August into the fall, and the birch polypore September and October.
Okay, thank you. It's very helpful.
Let's see, going back over to Facebook. So Gavin says, for a beginner, when cut, do most poisonous mushrooms turn blue or just certain types?
No, learn your mushroom individually. Make decisions based on its edibility or not individually and go slowly. There are almost no generalities that work.
And for our Facebook, go ahead.
Someone asked about poison documents by NAMA, about 10 years old. Every couple of years they will put out a report about the mushrooms, the poisoning mushrooms the past year or 2 years. That document that was a 30-year compilation, was kind of a one of its kind. Still has a lot of valuable information in it.
Thank you. And just for our Facebook folks, we know that you came into this a bit late, but we have it recorded and we'll be putting up on Facebook and on our YouTube channel, so you can catch all of Greg's awesome presentation, and he had great screenshots, and it's been pretty fantastic. So we're sorry about the delay, but you'll still be able to get the whole thing.
Someone asked me if the mushrooms that were kind of that opening, I call it kind of mushroom porn, that visual images, are they available? No, I don't share those. Those, you know, as you saw, some of them were embedded into the PowerPoint, but they are just what they are.
Let's see. Beth would like to know if you happen to know the late Walter Lytton.
I knew the late Walter Lytton when he was around and studying and playing and teaching mushrooming down east. Yeah, it was a wonderful resource in the area. There's another person now down east, a great man, David Porter, who retired from University of Georgia and is offering some mushrooming education in that region. Is a wonderful resource for that part of the state.
Thank you. Let's see, I see in the chat someone wanting to know, how long can you keep harvested chaga?
The key is it on your windowsill in the sun, or is it, you know, in a container that's kind of out of the air? And if it's been protected that way, you can keep it for quite a while. You'll find that some of the terpenes have some volatility to them, and they will work their way out. But a lot of the components would still be good.
And I did want to say, I'm not sure if she's still in, but I did see Dr. Karen Simone from the Northern New England Poison Control Center had joined us. And so I don't know if you're still here, Karen, and if you wanted to add anything. Scrolling through to see if we may have lost her. But yes, Karen, you were speaking very nicely about the, the poison control. Let's see. Are there any future organized forays going to be online for ID discussions?
We are talking about at the Maine through the Maine Mycological Association about having a few virtual forays early in the season. We're still trying to work out the bugs. We need to try and test drive it to see if it's going to work. You know, doing a foray virtually is hard. And all of the people that belong to the Maine Mycological, you know, we do so because we love to be out in the woods playing with the mushrooms. And this whole virtual thing is like a whole new world we're trying to get used to. We'll see. You'll stay tuned. And if you're a member of the Maine Mycological, you'll certainly get, we'll get the updates on that when they get scheduled. Good question.
Great. Let me see.
Who is the doctor?
Okay.
From Control. The doctor from Poison Control is Dr. Karen Simone.
Yes, and I don't think I see her. Simone, let me see if.
I do. She's waving. It's under, I think it might be under Simone K.
Simone K. That's Karen.
Let me find her and unmute. Ah, there you are. Unmuting you. Okay, you should be good again.
I tried to say something, but I was muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
You could sell that to my husband. I'm pretty sure he'd like to use that. So I guess there are a couple things for me. First of all, we'd like to thank Greg. He is terrific. He didn't say this, but he is on call for us 24/7. And when you call the Poison Center, you're going to get nurses, pharmacists, and physicians who are certified and boarded in toxicology and poisoning. So you're not just getting any person answering the phone. But what we're good at is, what will the mushroom do to you? What Greg is amazing at is, which mushroom is this? And we can't decide how to help you if we don't know what the mushroom is. So we work together as a team, but he's just amazing. He's available just anytime. Sunday, 3 a.m., we have an emergency and he's there. So thank you, Greg. For everybody else, please do not hesitate to text, chat, or call the Poison Center whenever you have a problem. If you're just a little sick and not sure, it's okay. There's somebody there. We're awake is 24/7. Don't hesitate to do it. And I wanted to ask, is there anybody on from Vermont? Or are there any plant foragers on?
And you can also use the 3 dots to raise your hands under participants.
And I'm not sure I can, oh, yep, I have some yeses. Okay. If I know this is all about mushrooms, but we have had a drastic increase, not sure if it's related to COVID, but there are these plants that people like to forage in the spring called ramps. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with them. It's like a wild garlic or onion, and when they're very young, evidently they look enough like false hellebore that people pick the wrong ones. And we have had already 25 exposures in just 2 months and 17 within this last month. Most of these are in Vermont, but these aren't people who are just vomiting a couple times and they're okay. They're in the hospital, in the intensive care units, getting drugs because their hearts are beating too slowly and their pressures are too low. And that sometimes goes along with numbness, tingling, vomiting, severe vomiting, and just being dizzy and whatnot. But dangerous cases from mistakes made from foraging these plants. So I'm just going to ask if, Greg, I hope you don't mind, that if you guys harvest those ramps, please just don't do it. This year we're having all kinds of problems. We have problems every year, but people are making a lot of mistakes this year, and it's not a small thing. It's very serious.
Mm.
That
Yeah.
sounds scary. Maybe we get a picture of that one to share.
Post that on your thing,
Yeah.
Jen. Yeah. And again, I know people sometimes hesitate to go to the emergency room when they're feeling ill. Don't hesitate to call the Poison Center. Their staff are wonderful, and they can really help inform your decisions on when to go to the ED. And they don't even pay me anything, so the things that I do are totally based on reality.
I see, oh, go ahead. So there's another question, someone wanting to know about the Maine Mycological Club benefits.
I mean, $12 a year, you get a lot. But I mean, any of the forays, we do a 4 times a year newsletter, and you get access to a bunch of goofy, fashion conscious people who are out in the woods collecting mushrooms and willing to share their knowledge. You can't beat that. It's a great group of folks.
Awesome. Well, that's all the comments and questions we've got between both of our platforms. Does anyone else have a question before we wrap up? Either raise your hand or type it in the comments. Let's see.
And thanks again to the folks at the library, and for certainly to the Northern New England Poison Control for being there.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Greg. You said you're going to be at Belfast next?
Yes.
Yes. Great.
And there is a question just asking for good resources online. And I think we'll be sharing some of those.
Online, in terms of mushroom identification, there's my 2 go-to places are mushroomexpert.com, and the place I go most often, unfortunately it's in French, is Quebec. It's the website of the Quebec Mycological Association, and they are wonderful. Those are my 2 go-tos.
Great.
Okay,
All
I'm going
right.
to add those to our resource page where we have foraging for mushrooms, just in case anybody missed that.
Yeah, MyCoquebec. Michael Quebec, I put in the chat. And you're welcome, Laura Struby. Michael, just type it in your search engine. It'll come up.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. This has been wonderful. And yeah, we'll have everything up so folks can watch it again, because like Greg says, know your mushrooms.
And happy birthday, Katie, because she emailed us at the library saying that for her birthday, all she wanted to do was do something with mushroom foraging, and she didn't think that she would have the opportunity because of what's going on. So she was very excited for this, Greg.
Good.
Awesome. We won't sing to you though, Katie.
You can collect and enjoy the mushrooms and never, ever, ever eat them. Don't feel like if you're collecting mushrooms, you need to eat them.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll hopefully see you soon. Thanks for bearing with us. Take care, all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Yeah.